So the Imperial Presidency exists around the idea that the executive has become more and more powerful over time. And that hasn't always been the case. When the country first began in the late 18th century and then throughout the 19th century, with the exception maybe of Abraham Lincoln and maybe James K. Polk, the presidency mostly concentrated on foreign matters and Congress took care of domestic matters. And that's really where the president's purview lies in the Constitution, as commander-in-chief, as a person who signs treaties and appoints ambassadors and so on, as head of state. He mostly concentrates on foreign affairs, so not exactly a powerhouse of governmental action. And in fact, the wars that we were involved in, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and so on, for the most part, they were short-lived and usually successful. The one exception, of course, will be Commander Abraham Lincoln. But as commander-in-chief in particular, because the military was kept so small throughout American history, really up until World War II and the Cold War, even after a war was settled, for instance, almost immediately afterwards, the size of the military was slashed. So the president, even in his most pronounced title in the Constitution, commander-in-chief, he didn't exactly have a huge amount of influence except during those short-lived wars. So even in the case of Abraham Lincoln, his war powers just existed during the Civil War, and certainly if he would have lived, he would have seen maybe his influence decrease quite a bit as the Civil War ended. One thing that has increased the power, or at least the seeming power of the presidency, has been media attention. Even in the 19th century, the 1800s, a lot of newspapers obviously paid a lot of attention to the presidency. For instance, one of the reasons why the Civil War happened is because the South was so upset over Abraham Lincoln getting elected, but he was just one person. There was an entire Congress that was also elected and the various governors. And so even back then, the media focused a lot of their attention on one specific person. And as we've changed technology, introducing radio in the 1920s and then television by the 1950s, more and more concentration has gone just to the President of the United States. Many people can't name who their Congress members are in the House or the Senate, but they can certainly name the President of the United States. And we can see that with both successes and failures. Often when the economy does well, the president gets credit. And when it doesn't do well, the president gets blame. Even though we're a capitalist country, really it's businesses and employees that make the economy run, not the government. So media attention also helps make the president seem a lot more powerful than it might be, but it also helps them gain sway because they're the center of attention. They can bring a lot of positivity to their cause, help get members of Congress elected, help boost governors, for instance. And so in a way, that media also helps them become a little bit more powerful by perhaps getting other people to want to be beside them or ride their coattails, as a phrase we use in politics, to popularity. Some historical examples of imperial presidents, like I said, we can go back to the 19th century and look at President Polk or Abraham Lincoln in particular, because Congress basically let Lincoln get his way so he could do whatever he wanted in order to win the Civil War. But really, the 20th century is filled with some of the best examples. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the first ones to get involved heavily in domestic policy, with things like the Food and Drug Act, with Meat Inspection Act, with conservation projects and establishment of national parks. And then he also kind of shied away from the isolationist policies of the country of the past because he wanted us to be more involved in Latin America. He wanted to help build the Panama Canal, for instance. He saw that as necessary to benefit American trade. And so he really stepped up our involvement in the world quite a bit of time before we would be ready for that, because that wouldn't happen until World War II. And then, of course, we have his cousin, not first cousin, but distant cousin, FDR, who ended up doing just that. With the Great Depression's New Deal programs, he got the government massively involved in the economy, and he also was a significant commander-in-chief during World War II. But the war effort wasn't the only part he was involved with, because remember, he also helped establish the alliance with the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and then toward the end of the war, continued to be allied with Great Britain and started to build kind of the alliance that would eventually become NATO under Harry Truman to help stop the Soviet Union from expanding their power. And with the Cold War is when you really saw Congress kind of let the president go their own way, especially when it came to police actions around the world, sending aid or troops to places to stop communism. And really, they kind of shied away from the idea that they should be the one declaring war. So Korea and Vietnam were both massive wars that did not involve an official war declaration from Congress against those countries. And so they were basically letting the president take these actions with only just a congressional resolution, not an actual war declare. And after Watergate happened and Nixon resigned in disgrace because some of his campaign had been spying on the Democrat headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, then because of some of his actions of expanding the war in Vietnam into surrounding countries, after he left, Congress decided to pass the War Powers Act to make sure that he and following presidents had to ask permission if they sent troops anywhere longer than 60 days. So that kind of trimmed their wings. But really, Congress continued to expand presidential power because even though they said that, they're basically now giving permission for the president to send troops anywhere for 2 months at a time before they get official permission from Congress. And they also, in the 70s and 80s, turned some of their powers over trade, like with enacting tariffs, taxes on imports, over to the president, and also some of the powers involving signing treaties, like with economic treaties with other countries, over to the president as well. And they also signed over some of the powers they have over citizenship because they saw, well, what happens if there's some dangerous group coming here? And so they signed over some of the citizenship powers to the president. So some of the things President Trump has been involved with earlier in his administration, tariffs, treaties, and banning certain countries from having immigrants come here, really that isn't his fault. It was Congress that gave all those powers to him. So it really has been Congress that's been creating the imperial presidency. Some people say imperial presidency doesn't really exist because it just seems that way because they get so much attention, and Congress could take back those powers anytime they wanted to, and they could also impeach and remove the president if he did something illegal. So many people say the imperial presidency is just an image because of media, and that in reality Congress could still hold all the power if they wanted to. Are there any questions about any of that? None? Okay, make sure you submit those 3 significant points in the daily participation.